A lonely millionaire finds two young people stealing food to survive and decides to help them, not imagining that they are hiding a secret capable of destroying a criminal organization. But when he tries to protect them, he discovers that the real threat is closer than he thought. What would you do in his place? In the darkness of an alley, the night seemed to drown out any trace of humanity. Daniel Alcantara walked with a firm step, seeking shelter from the rain. Suddenly, a dry sound broke the silence. Something had fallen near a small shop. Moved by instinct, he stopped and looked. There, next to a broken box of fruit, were two young figures. A girl with tangled hair and intense eyes held a loaf of bread, while a smaller boy, with a pale face, clung to her arm. The shop owner ran out screaming, but the girl, far from being intimidated, faced him with a mixture of fear and defiance. Daniel couldn't help but remember a time when he himself had felt that desperation. "Hey, stop there," he intervened, approaching calmly. The young woman, seeing him, took a step back, positioning herself in front of the boy as if she wanted to protect him. "We don't want any trouble," she said, her voice heavy with hardness and exhaustion. Daniel raised his hands in a sign of peace. "Relax, I'm not going to hurt them," he replied in a calm voice. He looked at the shop owner and, without hesitation, offered him money to pay for what they had taken. The man grunted something but accepted and returned inside his shop. Clara, as she later introduced herself, looked at him suspiciously. "Why would you do this? We're not your problem." Daniel just smiled. Sometimes helping someone is the right thing to do. The boy Raphael didn't say anything, but his grateful look was impossible to ignore. Daniel, observing his condition, made a decision. "I have a house nearby. It's not a palace, but there is food and a warm bed. If you want to come..." Clara frowned, clearly torn between accepting and running away. Finally, a whisper from Raphael tipped the balance. "Okay, but if you try anything weird, I'll know," Clara said, her tone warning, causing Daniel to chuckle softly. Daniel's house was the complete opposite of the chaos in the alley. Spacious, warm, filled with books and memories of a quiet life. As he entered, Raphael's eyes lit up, but Clara remained alert, inspecting every corner. Luisa, Daniel's strict housekeeper, appeared almost immediately. "What does this mean, Mr. Alcantara?" she asked with a frown, looking disapprovingly at the newcomers. "They are guests," he replied firmly, cutting off any protest. Despite Luisa's initial objections, Daniel made sure Clara and Raphael had some food and a place to rest. Raphael ate with gusto, while Clara barely touched her plate, preferring to look around. As night fell, Daniel led them to a guest room. "You're safe here. Rest," he said, before closing the door softly. As he made his way to his own room, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. Clara's expression, so full of mistrust, reminded him of his own struggle years ago. He knew there was something more behind those eyes, something that hadn't yet surfaced. Daniel's mansion was a haven of calm, but for Clara and Raphael it was a strange, almost overwhelming place. The spacious rooms, the elegant furniture, and the constant silence made everything seem too perfect, too far removed from their reality. Raphael, however, began to relax. After eating for the first time in days, his shy smile appeared as he curiously scanned every corner of the room. Clara, on the other hand, remained on guard. Although she appreciated Daniel's kindness, something in her resisted trusting him completely. She watched every gesture, every word carefully, as if she expected to find a hint of some hidden trap. Daniel sensed this tension in Clara, but he didn't try to force a connection. He knew that time was the only ally in situations like this. Instead, he focused on Raphael, telling him simple stories about the objects in the house. An antique clock that belonged to his grandfather, a painting he had bought during a trip. Raphael listened with shining eyes, fascinated by a world that seemed so far away from his own. As evening fell, Luisa served a simple but comforting dinner. Raphael ate heartily, but Clara barely touched her plate, playing with her fork as she cast fleeting glances toward Daniel. "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to tell me," he offered with a genuine smile. Clara nodded silently, non-committally. When night came, Daniel showed them a room at the end of the hall. The bed had crisp white sheets, and there was a small lamp that gave off a warm light. Raphael threw himself onto the mattress with a sigh of relief, but Clara remained standing by the door. "Thank you for all this," he finally murmured, though his tone remained cautious. Daniel nodded. "You don't have to thank me. Rest easy. You're safe here." As Clara closed the door behind him, Daniel couldn't help but think about how much those two reminded him of his younger sister, when they were both just children struggling to survive in an indifferent world. Later that evening, as he was going through some papers in his study, a slight noise caught his attention. He stepped out into the hallway and, looking toward the guest room, noticed lamplight filtering in from under the door. Approaching carefully, he heard a whisper, Clara's voice. "Everything will be okay, Raphael. We have to stay strong. For Mom and Dad." Daniel felt a knot in his stomach, realizing that the burden these children carried was much greater than he imagined. He decided not to interrupt and return to his study, but he couldn't concentrate. Something about Clara's behavior made him uneasy. There was a shadow in her gaze, a secret that held on tight to it. Daniel knew that to really help them, he would have to find out what it was. The morning began quietly in the mansion, with the aroma of freshly baked bread filling the air. Raphael sat at the dining table, still sleepy, while Clara remained alert as usual. Daniel watched them from the entrance, trying to decipher Clara's thoughts. There was something about her, something hidden, that kept him restless. While Raphael played with a small toy car he had found in a corner of the living room, Daniel took the opportunity to talk to Clara. "If there's anything you need, anything that's worrying you, you can tell me," he said calmly. Clara stared at him, assessing him. Finally, in a dry tone, she replied, "We're fine. Thank you." Daniel didn't insist, but his words seemed to contain a weight she didn't want to let go of. Later, while Daniel was going through some papers in his study, he heard a noise in the hallway. He closed his folder and went out to investigate. Clara was at the opposite end of the hallway, in front of one of the rooms that had been closed for months. Seeing her, she quickly closed the door and crossed her arms, facing him with a defiant expression. "What were you doing there?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "It's just a room," Clara replied indifferently, but her gaze avoided his. Daniel took a few steps forward, sensing that something was wrong. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. "Clara, I need to know what's going on. I can't help you if you keep things from me." For a moment, she didn't say anything. She seemed to be debating internally, as if she were weighing the consequences of trusting him. Finally, she sighed and pulled a small key from her pocket. "Okay, I'll show you, but you have to promise not to ask questions." Daniel nodded, even though he knew he couldn't fully keep that promise. When she opened the door, she found a small black bag on the bed. Clara quickly grabbed it and opened it, revealing the contents: a pile of documents, photographs, and a USB flash drive. "What is this?" Daniel asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "Evidence," Clara said quietly. "Evidence against an organization that has done horrible things. My mom got it before." Her voice broke, and she looked away. Daniel felt the air grow thicker. "Why haven't you taken this to the police?" "I can't trust anyone," Clara replied firmly. "And now that they know I have this, they're looking for me. That's why we ran. That's why we can't stay here for long." Daniel remained silent. Now he understood why Clara was so alert, so distrustful. He knew that by getting involved, he was putting himself in danger too, but his decision had already been made. He would not leave them alone. Clara's confession left Daniel lost in thought as night fell over the mansion. The young woman's words echoed in his mind. "I can't trust anyone." Even though he knew his involvement put them all in danger, he felt he had to protect them, as if an invisible debt tied him to them. In the silence of his study, with a glass of whiskey in his hand, Daniel let the memories wash over him. It was as if Clara and Raphael had opened a door that had been closed for years. He vividly remembered the days of his childhood in a poor neighborhood, where he and his younger sister, Anna, struggled every day to survive. Anna had been the light in his life, a girl with an easy laugh and bright eyes despite the difficulties. Daniel worked at whatever he could to bring food home, while Anna dreamed of a better future. But that future never came. One night, while Daniel was out trying to get some money, Anna became seriously ill. When he returned, it was too late. Her death devastated him, filling him with a guilt that he could never overcome. Since then, Daniel had sworn that he would not allow anyone else to suffer like them. That promise had driven his success in business, building a comfortable and secure life, but it had also left him empty. Now looking at Clara and Raphael, he saw in them an opportunity to redeem himself, to fulfill the promise he could not keep for Anna. The next day, Daniel watched from a corner of the living room as Raphael played on the floor with an old puzzle that Louisa had found in the attic. Her childish laughter filled the house, but Clara remained distant, her gaze fixed on the window. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," Daniel commented as he approached her. Clara glanced at him, but didn't answer. Finally, he sighed and sat down in a chair across from her. "I know what it's like to carry things that seem bigger than you, but you don't have to do it alone." She looked at him, clearly surprised by his words. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her tone fluctuating between curiosity and distrust. Daniel took a moment before answering. "Because I failed before, because I couldn't save someone I cared about, and because I don't plan on failing this time." Clara didn't answer right away, but something in her expression changed. For the first time, her gaze was not filled with distrust, but something closer to understanding. Later, while Raphael slept soundly, Daniel sat in the study, going over the documents Clara had brought. The evidence was compelling, but also dangerous. With each page he turned, he understood more of the risk they were running and the scope of the organization that was after them. One thing was certain: this would not be solved easily, and the threat would not be stopped. However, if there was one thing Daniel had learned, it was that protecting Clara and Raphael was now his mission, no matter the price. The calm in the mansion didn't last long. Daniel had anticipated it from the moment he saw Clara's documents. He knew that the organization behind that evidence wouldn't sit idly by, and the first hint of that came one afternoon, while he was checking some emails on his computer. The house phone rang, a sound that echoed louder than usual in the silence. Louisa answered it, but her face tightened at the voice on the other end. Without saying a word, she handed the receiver to Daniel. "We know you have something that doesn't belong to you, Alcantara," said a cold, calculating male voice. "We suggest you return it before things get complicated." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the man speak, trying to pick up on any details that might give away his identity. But the call ended abruptly, leaving a sense of impending danger in the air. "Who was it?" Clara asked as she saw him hanging up. She was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Someone who wants what you have," Daniel replied, his tone firm but calm. Clara pressed her lips together. "I told you this was dangerous. We shouldn't have stayed here." "And I told you I wouldn't leave you alone," he replied. "I won't let them find you. But we have to be more careful." That night, Daniel checked the mansion's security cameras. At first glance, there were no signs of unusual activity, but he couldn't trust them. He knew these people were unconventional. They would find a way to get close, and he had to get ahead of them. Meanwhile, Clara and Raphael remained together in the guest room. Raphael was fast asleep, but Clara sat by the window looking out at the dark garden. Her mind was filled with thoughts: her brother's safety, her guilt for having brought Daniel into this danger, and the constant fear of being found. Suddenly, a noise outside caught his attention. He stood up immediately, looking into the thicket of trees. He saw nothing, but his heart began to pound. The next day, Daniel called an old friend, Arturo, a man who had worked as a private investigator. "I need to know who is behind this organization and how much they know about me," he told him bluntly. Arturo, though reluctant, agreed to help. That afternoon, however, a second call came to Daniel's phone. This time, the voice offered no warning. "We know where you are, we know who's with you, and you're not going to be able to protect them forever." Daniel hung up, his jaw set. He knew he could no longer trust anyone, not even his closest contacts. The only solution was to act before they did. As Clara watched from the doorway, Daniel made a decision. "We have to prepare ourselves," he said, more to himself than to her. "This is just the beginning." The following days were marked by increasing tension. Daniel took additional measures to reinforce the mansion's security: cameras, alarms, and a real-time surveillance system. However, something told him that the threats they faced would not only come from outside. Arturo, the private investigator Daniel had contacted, finally gave him a detailed report. "The organization is big, but what worries me is that they have eyes everywhere. And I fear that someone in your inner circle is already helping them, he said seriously. The thought of betrayal shook Daniel. He had learned to be distrustful in the past, but until now he had always believed he could count on his closest friends. He thought of Eduardo, an old business partner with whom he had shared secrets and plans over the years. Eduardo was the only person who knew about the situation with Clara and Rafael. That night, while Clara was going through the documents again, Daniel was lost in his thoughts. He couldn't ignore his growing distrust of Eduardo, but he still had no concrete evidence. He decided to proceed with caution. Clara, for her part, was more restless than ever. "Something's not right," she said as she closed the folder in front of her. Daniel looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I don't know. It's just a feeling. Like someone is watching us, even here," he replied, his voice filled with concern. Daniel understood that feeling. Paranoia seemed to have taken hold of everyone in the mansion. He decided to talk to Eduardo the next day, under the excuse of a chance meeting. When Eduardo arrived, he seemed relaxed, almost unconcerned, which made Daniel even more puzzled. "How are things with your guests?" Eduardo asked in a friendly tone, but the question sounded too calculated. "They're fine," Daniel replied, trying not to show any signs of distrust. But something about the way Eduardo avoided looking directly at him gave him the confirmation he needed. That same afternoon, Daniel checked the security cameras and found something disturbing. Eduardo had been at the mansion the previous week while he was out, supposedly to drop off some documents. In the images, Eduardo had spent more time than necessary in Daniel's office, reviewing papers that were none of his business. Daniel's stomach turned. He was now certain that Eduardo was working for the organization. That night, without telling Clara or Rafael, Daniel began planning his next moves. He knew he had to protect them at all costs, but he also knew he could no longer trust anyone else. Clara, meanwhile, noticed the change in Daniel's attitude. "What happened?" she asked, but he avoided answering directly. "Nothing you need to worry about, but we have to be prepared. This is going to get more complicated than I thought." Clara looked at him in silence, feeling that something big was about to happen. Preparations to expose the organization were moving quickly. Daniel knew that time was limited and that the only way to protect Clara and Rafael was to expose the incriminating documents. Together with Clara, they worked out a plan to reveal the evidence during a public ceremony to be held at a local theater, an event packed with influential personalities in the press. There, Daniel had contacts who could ensure that the information would get into the right hands. "This is our best chance," Daniel said as he spread a map of the theater on the table. Clara nodded seriously, though her gaze reflected fear of what could go wrong. Rafael, oblivious to the real danger, played nearby with Luisa, who kept him distracted. The evening of the event arrived quickly. Daniel was dressed in an impeccable suit, but his face was marked by tension. Clara wore a simple black dress that Luisa had tailored for her. She looked more grown up than her age, with her shoulders squared and her eyes focused on the mission. "Rafael is staying here with me," Luisa insisted as Clara hugged him tightly before leaving. Clara hesitated for a moment, but finally gave in. "He'll be safe with you," she whispered, though her heart was heavy at leaving him behind. At the theater, the atmosphere was elegant, full of conversation and dazzling lights. Daniel and Clara moved cautiously, avoiding drawing too much attention to themselves. Daniel carried a copy of the documents with him, hidden inside a briefcase. "When the presenter comes on stage, we will take the microphone," he explained to Clara. Something wasn't right, though. Clara sensed it first. Persistent stares from different points in the room, men with headsets moving in sync. She approached Daniel and muttered, "They found us." Before they could react, two men approached them. "Mr. Alcantara, we need you to come with us," one of them said with a cold smile. Daniel recognized them immediately. They were not security for the event, but for the organization. "Run," he whispered to Clara as he pushed the briefcase towards her. Without a second thought, Clara slipped through the crowd, holding the briefcase to her chest. Daniel, for his part, he stayed to distract the men, confronting them with words while trying to buy time. Clara left through a side door, but she was not alone. At least 3 men followed her, and with each passing second, the risk increased. In an alley behind the theater, she was forced to stop. "I'm not giving them anything," she said bravely, though her voice trembled slightly. "Then you leave us no choice," one of them replied before approaching. But before he could touch her, A loud noise echoed. A car braked sharply next to the alley. From the driver's seat, Louisa appeared with a determined expression. "Get in!" she shouted. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran towards the car as the men tried to catch up with her, but Louisa stepped on the accelerator just in time. Inside the vehicle, Clara was breathing heavily. "And Daniel?" she asked. "I don't know, but we have to go back to the mansion and make sure Raphael is safe," Louisa replied firmly. At the theater, Daniel was still struggling to free himself. He knew that his capture had been part of the organization's plan, but he was willing to face them if it meant protecting Clara and Raphael. The mansion was plunged into an eerie silence. Clara and Louisa had arrived hours ago, with Raphael asleep on the couch, oblivious to the chaos that surrounded them. Clara kept pacing back and forth, with her briefcase in her hands while her mind revolved around the same question. What had happened to Daniel? "We can't just wait here," Clara finally said, stopping in front of Louisa, who was making tea in the kitchen to calm her nerves. "He saved us. Now it's my turn." Louisa sighed, putting her cup down on the table. "Listen, kid, going after them without a plan is suicide. But if we're going to do something, it'll be with a cool head." At that moment, Raphael woke up and clung to Clara, worried. "Where's Daniel?" he asked in a trembling voice. Clara hugged him tightly. "He'll be back. I promise he'll be back." But deep inside, he knew he had to act. With Louisa's help, Clara began to search for clues. She remembered how Daniel always wrote down important details in a notebook he kept in his study. There they found what they needed, an address. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a perfect place to keep someone hidden. "It's a huge risk," Louisa warned, but Clara was determined. "I can't leave him there. Not after everything he did for us." Hours later, Clara arrived at the warehouse. The place was dark and desolate, with broken windows and a musty smell permeating the air. She walked forward silently with her briefcase under her arm, trying not to make any noise. In one of the main rooms, she saw him. Daniel was tied to a chair, his face battered but his gaze still full of determination. In front of him were two men, arguing about what to do with the documents. "Those papers will never leave here," said one of them. Clara gritted her teeth, her heart pounding. She needed a distraction. She looked around and found a metal bar leaning against the wall. She grabbed it and hit a nearby pipe, creating a loud bang that made the men turn around immediately. "There!" one of them shouted, running towards the source of the sound. Clara took advantage of the chaos to approach Daniel. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, clearly surprised. "Rescuing you," Clara replied as she cut the ropes with a knife she had taken from the kitchen before leaving. The men's footsteps were getting closer, but before they could catch up, Louisa appeared in the doorway, brandishing a pistol she had pulled from her bag. "Get back, or I'll shoot," she shouted with a conviction that brooked no doubt. With Louisa's help, they managed to get out of the warehouse and into the car. Daniel, though exhausted, couldn't help but smile as he looked at Clara. "I never thought you'd come for me." "What you did for us deserves much more than that," Clara replied, her voice firm, but with a flash of gratitude. Back at the mansion, Daniel knew the battle was far from over. But that night, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was not alone in this fight. The early morning at the mansion was full of activity. Clara and Daniel, exhausted but determined, organized the documents they still had. Every paper, every photograph, and every file on the USB drive was a key piece to bringing down the organization. Raphael slept soundly on the couch, while Louisa made coffee in the kitchen, her face serious and focused. "This has to be perfect," Daniel said, looking through a set of documents. "We can't make any mistakes. If we make this public, there's no turning back." Clara nodded. Although she was tired, the adrenaline kept her going. "The question is, where will we do it? We almost got caught last time." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his computer monitor. "This time it won't be in person. We'll use technology to our advantage." He had decided that the documents would be released online and through the most influential media outlets, ensuring that the evidence would reach the public before the organization could react. As they worked, an alarm went off on the mansion's security system. Daniel immediately stood up, looking at the cameras. A black car was parked in front of the entrance, and two men in dark suits got out. "They're here," Clara said, her voice tense. Daniel closed the computer and hid the flash drive in his pocket. "Louisa, stay with Raphael. "Clara, come with me," he said firmly, taking a small pistol from a desk drawer. The men knocked loudly on the door. Daniel opened a small space, facing them with apparent calm. "What do you want?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. "We know you have something that doesn't belong to you, Mr. Alcantara. Give it to us and no one will get hurt," said one of the men. Daniel smiled coldly. "It's too late now. What they're after is already in the hands of people they can't buy or intimidate." The men's expressions changed, and one of them pulled out a gun. But before he could do anything, a loud siren sound filled the air. Daniel smiled even wider. Clara watched from the hallway as a dozen patrol cars surrounded the mansion. Daniel had called the police hours earlier, giving them some of the evidence to ensure their cooperation. The men tried to flee, but officers stopped them before they could reach the car. Clara and Luisa watched from the windows as they were arrested, though they both knew it wasn't the end. By the next day, the documents had been published on several online platforms, and the news broke. The organization was exposed, its leaders identified, and a formal investigation was announced by the authorities. However, Daniel knew that not all of those involved would be caught. These people had resources and connections, and they would not give up easily. That night, as the world began to react to the scandal, Daniel, Clara, and Raphael sat in the living room, sharing a moment of relative peace. "We did it," Clara said, though her voice was heavy with weariness. "We've done it for now," Daniel corrected, "but there are still pieces of this game to be solved." Clara looked at him with determination. "Then we will make sure that nothing is left unresolved." The mansion, which had witnessed so many moments of tension and danger, now breathed a different air. The case against the organization had gained momentum, with continued arrests of people linked to its operations. Although the news celebrated the progress, Daniel knew that the shadows of that world would not disappear completely. Clara and Raphael were in the garden. The sun was shining, and Raphael was playing with a ball that Daniel had given him. His laughter filled the space, a melody that contrasted with the dark days they had left behind. Clara, sitting on a wooden bench, watched him with a slight smile, something Daniel had rarely seen on her. "She looks happy," Daniel said, approaching with 2 cups of tea. He offered one to Clara, who accepted with a slight nod. "For the first time in a long time," she replied, looking at her brother as he ran after the ball. Then her expression became more serious. "And you? What's next for you after all this?" Daniel leaned back against the bench, staring out into the distance. "I don't know. This changed a lot of things for me. I thought I was protecting you guys, but in the end, I think you saved me." Clara looked at him, surprised by his honesty. She had learned to see Daniel as someone strong, almost unbreakable, but in that moment she sensed the vulnerability behind his strength. "I always wanted Raphael to have a different life, something better. And now I think it's possible," Clara said, with a hopeful tone that Daniel hadn't heard before. As they talked, Louisa appeared from the house with a tray of freshly baked cookies. "I haven't worked here for so many years that everyone forgets to eat," she said with a smile, placing the tray on the garden table. The relaxed atmosphere was a much-needed respite. However, Daniel knew things wouldn't be that simple. That very morning, he had received an anonymous email with a warning: "This isn't over." The words were etched in his mind, but he decided not to share them just yet. Later, Clara and Daniel met in the studio. She was carrying a small notebook in her hand, where she had been writing down ideas. "I want to use this to help other kids like Raphael and me," she said, handing him the notebook. Daniel looked at it, impressed. On the pages were ideas for a community project: shelters, education programs, psychological support. It was an ambitious dream, but possible. Clara watched from the hallway as a dozen patrol cars surrounded the mansion. Daniel had called the police hours earlier, giving them some of the evidence to ensure their cooperation. The men tried to flee, but officers stopped them before they could reach the car. Clara and Luisa watched from the windows as they were arrested, though they both knew it wasn't the end. By the next day, the documents had been published on several online platforms, and the news broke. The organization was exposed, its leaders identified, and a formal investigation was announced by the authorities. However, Daniel knew that not all of those involved would be caught. These people had resources and connections, and they would not give up easily. That night, as the world began to react to the scandal, Daniel, Clara, and Raphael sat in the living room, sharing a moment of relative peace. Clara watched from the hallway as a dozen patrol cars surrounded the mansion. Daniel had called the police hours earlier, giving them some of the evidence to ensure their cooperation. The men tried to flee, but officers stopped them before they could reach the car. Clara and Luisa watched from the windows as they were arrested, though they both knew it wasn't the end. By the next day, the documents had been published on several online platforms, and the news broke. The organization was exposed, its leaders identified, and a formal investigation was announced by the authorities. However, Daniel knew that not all of those involved would be caught. These people had resources and connections, and they would not give up easily. That night, as the world began to react to the scandal, Daniel, Clara, and Raphael sat in the living room, sharing a moment of relative peace. "We did it," Clara said, though her voice was heavy with weariness. "We've done it for now," Daniel corrected, "but there are still pieces of this game to be solved." Clara looked at him with determination. "Then we will make sure that nothing is left unresolved." The mansion, which had witnessed so many moments of tension and danger, now breathed a different air. The case against the organization had gained momentum, with continued arrests of people linked to its operations. Although the news celebrated the progress, Daniel knew that the shadows of that world would not disappear completely. Clara and Raphael were in the garden. The sun was shining, and Raphael was playing with a ball that Daniel had given him. His laughter filled the space, a melody that contrasted with the dark days they had left behind. Clara, sitting on a wooden bench, watched him with a slight smile, something Daniel had rarely seen on her. "She looks happy," Daniel said, approaching with 2 cups of tea. He offered one to Clara, who accepted with a slight nod. "For the first time in a long time," she replied, looking at her brother as he ran after the ball. Then her expression became more serious. "And you? What's next for you after all this?" Daniel leaned back against the bench, staring out into the distance. "I don't know. This changed a lot of things for me. I thought I was protecting you guys, but in the end, I think you saved me." Clara looked at him, surprised by his honesty. She had learned to see Daniel as someone strong, almost unbreakable, but in that moment she sensed the vulnerability behind his strength. "I always wanted Raphael to have a different life, something better. And now I think it's possible," Clara said, with a hopeful tone that Daniel hadn't heard before. As they talked, Luisa appeared from the house with a tray of freshly baked cookies. "I haven't worked here for so many years that everyone forgets to eat," she said with a smile, placing the tray on the garden table. The relaxed atmosphere was a much-needed respite. However, Daniel knew things wouldn't be that simple. That very morning, he had received an anonymous email with a warning: "This isn't over." The words were etched in his mind, but he decided not to share them just yet. Later, Clara and Daniel met in the studio. She was carrying a small notebook in her hand, where she had been writing down ideas. "I want to use this to help other kids like Raphael and me," she said, handing him the notebook. Daniel looked at it, impressed. On the pages were ideas for a community project: shelters, education programs, psychological support. It was an ambitious dream, but possible. "It's a good start," Daniel said, handing the notebook back, "and I want to help you make it happen." The following days were marked by new decisions. Daniel began selling some of his properties to finance the project, while Clara dedicated herself to structuring it. Raphael, for his part, began attending a local school, something they had never imagined possible. Although the scars of the past were still present, there was a sense of hope in every corner of the mansion. As she said goodbye to Daniel one afternoon, Clara looked him straight in the eyes. "Thank you for everything," he smiled. "Thank you for reminding me what really matters." As she walked away, Clara felt that something had changed forever, not just in her, but in all of them. Although they knew that new challenges might arise, this time they were prepared to face them together. The story of Daniel, Clara, and Raphael teaches us that sometimes life puts us in situations where we must choose between our comfort and the risk of helping others. Daniel decided to act from the heart, facing his fears and finding a purpose that changed him forever. And you, what would you do if you were in their place? Would you risk everything for people you barely know? Click on the video on the screen to continue this incredible journey of self-discovery, where we explore how our decisions can define us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. and join us on the next adventure. See you in the next video.